Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2020 Online Hope. I'm Carolyn Berry, the Executive Director of Alzheimer's Arkansas. I would like to personally thank you for joining us in today's program. Now, our team has worked very hard this year to ensure that we bring the same support, education, and resources that we always have. It has been a little difficult, however, not impossible. We do it for you, the caregiver. Now, a Hope is a workshop designed to help encourage and improve the caregivers in their caregiving journey. I hope this year's program provides you with that support. Now, we cannot do this without our sponsors. So we want to take a moment at Alzheimer's Arkansas in honor of the caregivers to thank our sponsors, Elder Independence, Everett Buick GNC, Avenir Memory Care, and CareLink. So before you hear from our presenters today, let's take a moment and let's hear from our sponsors. Thank you and enjoy the program.
We all deserve the option to live independently. Elder Independence Home Care makes it possible. From 1 hour to 24/7, our local compassionate caregivers are prepared to be there for you. Between bathing, dressing, meal preparation, light housekeeping, errands, and more, we want to provide the care you deserve, plus specialized aid for Alzheimer's and dementia, transportation to and from doctor's appointments, and hospice support. Caring is our calling. Let us be there for you.
I'm Brandy Schneider with the UAMH Meeting Center, and today I want to talk to you about a topic that is often difficult to discuss. It's not anyone's favorite topic, but one that I feel is really important for caregivers to talk about and to understand. So while I'm pulling up my presentation, just let me ask you briefly, when I say the word grief or grieving, what types of things come to mind? What words come to your mind when I say the word grief or grieving? So often when we talk about grief, grieving, words that people pull out as coming to mind are things like loss or sadness. People will say that grief is emotional. It's often very painful. And that is true. All of those things are true of grief. It is very painful. It is often a very emotional response. We often associate grief with loss and with sadness. And we most often associate grief and grieving with death. After someone has died, what does that grieving process look like after death? What I want to talk to you about today is a little bit different. What I want to talk to you about is something we call pre-death grieving or anticipatory grief. And you will hear me use them interchangeably, and when you read about them, often hear about them in the literature, they are also used interchangeably. Another term you might see when talking about pre-death grieving is ambiguous loss. And really, they are all very similar. They're a little bit different, and we're going to go through the definitions here in just a minute, but you'll often see them used interchangeably because they're often very linked to each other, and you often are experiencing anticipatory grief and pre-death grieving all at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about what is anticipatory grief or pre-death grieving. The definition of anticipatory grief is the process associated with grieving the loss of a loved one in advance of their inevitable death. So if someone has cancer or someone has dementia, when you hear that diagnosis, you often think from that diagnosis that the person is going to die in the end. So you begin to anticipate the loss of that person. What will my life look like after the person is gone? How will things change after the person is gone? How will I cope after this person is gone? You begin to anticipate what life will feel like or what life will be like when that person is no longer here. Pre-death grief is a little bit different in its definition. It's an emotional experience that occurs prior to the physical death of the person, or a caregiver's emotional and physical response to the perceived losses in a valued care recipient. So what does that mean? Well, we know when you are a caregiver of someone with dementia, you're not just grieving the end, right? You're not just anticipating the grief that happens or that you anticipate is going to happen when your loved one passes. As a caregiver, you are experiencing losses with the person that you love along the course of the disease process. So you may be grieving things like the lack of the person's ability to drive, the lack of the person's ability to do a hobby or a job that they once loved. You may be grieving the loss when the person can no longer remember certain friends or family members, or when they can no longer communicate in the way that you are used to them being able to communicate. So pre-death grief incorporates all of those little losses or big losses that you experience along the way. We noticed, so I do a lot of work with caregivers. One of the roles that I play at the Schmeating Center is to work with caregivers individually, but also in group settings to help them navigate the course of the disease, to give them emotional support and education. And, we often notice this pre-death process start fairly early on in the dementia process. In fact, often by the time people have a diagnosis of dementia, by the time they get that diagnosis for their loved one, they've already started a little bit of this grieving process. They're already starting to notice some changes and some losses in the person that they love. And so that often is what prompts them to get a diagnosis. And then when they get the diagnosis, they hear the term dementia or Alzheimer's disease or frontotemporal dementia or whatever that diagnosis is. They've already begun the pre-death grief process, and now they are also experiencing some anticipatory grief. That grief of what is this going to look like in the end. So caregivers are very, very linked to the grieving process all the way from the beginning of that diagnosis, the beginning of those first sort of symptoms of dementia that make us think, aha, this is something that may not be fixable. This is something that I'm noticing, and this could be dementia. And so that grief process starts very early on with caregivers. And I'm anticipating that several of you watching this are probably thinking to yourselves, yeah, I think that probably I have been experiencing some grief. What we often see with caregivers is that, they start to experience this grief process, but we don't necessarily recognize that as grief. And so that's what I was starting to say earlier. I work with caregivers a lot and often in group settings. And when they start to talk about things they're experiencing, it often looks like grief. And that is really what got us at the Schmeating Center sort of interested in learning more about anticipatory grief and pre-death grieving, is that caregivers seem to be going through these grief processes over and over and over again, grieving a loss and then sort of getting past that grief, and then something different would happen and grieving that change or that loss again and getting past that grief and then grieving again. And so as they were describing the different things that they are experiencing, and as we watch this with our own loved ones who are taking care of family members, recognizing that this is a grief process that is happening over and over again, how do we better equip caregivers? How do we better talk to caregivers about what this grief process is, what that looks like, and how do we work through that sort of continuation of grieving throughout the process? As you can imagine, for those of you who are caregivers, it's hard. It's hard to be in grief all of the time. It's hard to grieve all of those little losses. And there are things that we can do to address that, things that will make that grieving process just a little bit easier. And we're going to talk about all of that as we go through the presentation today. I want to touch a little bit on risk factors for anticipatory grief. So when you look up anticipatory grief and pre-death grief in the literature, there's not a whole lot of information out there. What the literature says is, yes, we know that this is a thing. We know that pre-death grief is a thing. We know that anticipatory grief is a thing, but there's not a whole lot of information about, okay, so what do we do about that? How do we help caregivers cope with some of this anticipatory grief that they're experiencing? One of the things that the literature certainly does list are risk factors for anticipatory grief. And what I want to point out, while I am going to talk about a couple of risk factors, every caregiver is at risk for anticipatory grief. So I want to make sure that I stress that just because you don't fit into one of these categories I'm about to talk about, or just because you think you don't fit into one of these categories I'm about to talk about, I want to make sure that everyone understands that every caregiver is at risk and most likely does experience this pre-death anticipatory grief. What we know is that those who are at most risk for complications or difficult pre-death grief are those who fall into some of these categories. So one is dependency on the person with the illness. So this is, very, very common in sort of the older generation of people. You have spouses that have been married for 50, 60 years. And so for many of them, especially females, and I certainly don't want to say that males do not have this dependency, but we often see it in females because of their sort of generational gender roles, have a dependency on their spouse or the person with the illness. When you've been married for 50 or 60 years, you are very interdependent on each other. And especially if you haven't done a lot of the household decision making, if you haven't taken care of a lot of the day-to-day business with the household, you become very dependent on that person that you love. And for those individuals who have that dependency on the person with the illness, they often experience much more difficult anticipatory grief or complicated anticipatory and pre-death grief because they're concerned about not just, I'm going to miss this person that I love, not just what is my life going to be like emotionally without this person, but what am I going to do about all of these day-to-day tasks that this person has always done for me? How do I get the home repaired? How do I cook a meal? How do I pay the bills? And so that often becomes very enveloped in the risk factors for anticipatory grief and how they're grieving. Individuals who have low levels of social support. We often see this with people who maybe they've moved closer to their children. So mom has become ill with dementia, and so the family decides to move mom and dad closer to them. But that often takes them then away from friends or other family members, from the familiar environment that they have known. And so it takes them away from some of the social supports. And all of you are probably, several of you sitting here listening to this today, probably have this experience. I hear it all the time from caregivers. Well, I moved here to be closer to my children. I needed someone to support me. And so I moved here to be closer to my children. But now my kids are so busy. They have ball games and they're working full-time jobs and they have their own life. And so they're not giving me as much support as I thought I would get when I originally moved here. When that happens, when there are low levels of that social support, the risk factors for more difficult pre-death grieving goes up as well, because you're anticipating, again, what is that death going to look like? And I have no one to talk to about this. I don't feel like there's anyone that really understands what I'm going through. And so low social support also makes that anticipatory grief a little bit more difficult. And then difficulty finding meaning in the illness or the death. Some people, despite the difficulty of the disease process, can say things like, well, it's God's will, or I am learning patience through all of this, and they can find some meaning, something that gives them some support and encouragement throughout the disease process. Dementia is a hard disease to find meaning in, and we often spend a lot of time talking to caregivers about that. Why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to my loved one? And not everyone is going to find meaning in the illness or the death. It's difficult when you're losing someone you love to say this is happening for a reason, or I understand why this has to happen. Not everyone can find meaning in the death, and that's okay. You don't have to be able to find meaning in what's happening. Dementia is a cruel, cruel disease, and you may not be able to come to terms with how your loved one is dying. But people who have difficulty finding meaning in that loss, who have difficulty coping with what that disease process looks like, certainly experience more difficult pre-death and anticipatory grief. That doesn't mean that we can't walk through that grief in a very healthy way. It just means that often they experience a more difficult time understanding what that grief looks like. Again, just like with grief that happens post-death, everyone experiences pre-death grief and anticipatory grief a little bit differently. Not everyone is going to walk through it in the same way. Not everyone's going to experience it in the same way. Not everyone will feel the loss as deeply as what other people feel the loss. So I don't want this to become sort of a prescription for here's how I should grieve. I certainly don't want any of you to think that. I want to talk about the fact that this is a very real phenomenon, that when you feel like I'm grieving, I am mourning my husband already and he is still here. I am mourning the loss of this person that I love, even though I see him standing right here in front of me. That is a very common, very normal type of grief that you're feeling, and that there are ways to work through that. So just because you fall into one of these risk factors doesn't mean you have to find a way out of these risk factors. We're going to help build something for you as we go throughout this to help you a little bit with this risk for the anticipatory grief. So why should we address anticipatory and pre-death grief? So research suggests that the high levels of anticipatory grief predicted lower levels of positive problem solving, and then difficulty in post-death grieving. So what does that mean? Well, lower levels of positive problem solving. All of us know when we're depressed or when we're feeling bad, when we're sad, when we're tired, we just don't do as good of a job at problem solving or at logical thinking or rational thinking. So people who are experiencing these high levels of pre-death grief and they don't have support to help work through that, will often find it very difficult to problem solve. Will find it difficult to make decisions about their situation. And then more difficulty in post-death grieving. So we know that the grief process for dementia is very different often than someone who maybe has cancer or someone who dies suddenly from a heart attack. We have already talked about the fact that you grieve for a very, very long time. In fact, we often call dementia the long goodbye. And that's because you are watching parts of that person change throughout the entire journey. So it's healthy to grieve those losses. And when someone doesn't grieve those losses throughout or has a difficult time grieving those losses throughout, then they often have difficulty in the death as well. Guilt, caregivers live in guilt. Every one of you watching this today, I know, feels guilty about something you have done as a caregiver. That is probably one of the most common emotions that I hear caregivers talk to me about is guilt. And often that comes with not feeling like you've done the right thing throughout the disease process or not having made the right decisions. And that can be a type of grief process as well. So those people who do not work through that grief throughout often have a more difficult time with their post-death grieving. I often hear caregivers say, I don't feel guilty, or I don't feel bad that my husband has died. I'm glad that he is gone. He is no longer suffering. I have my life back, and I don't feel bad that he has died. So I feel guilty because I don't feel bad that he has died. I feel guilty because I should be sad, and I'm not sad. I'm actually relieved that he has died. Working through that grief throughout the dementia process makes those feelings of relief, makes those feelings of I am okay with this death much easier to deal with after the person has died. So for those of you who have lost a loved one, or for those of you who are thinking, I think I'm going to feel relief when this is over, being able to grieve throughout the process makes that post-death grieving better. It puts it into perspective, for lack of a better term, and helps you to sort of cope with that a little bit more. And anticipatory grief, when addressed and works well, it can provide a chance to prepare financially and socially but also to attend to any unfinished business with a dying person, and sort of to facilitate, as I was talking about, this natural segue into death. So I know that the person I love is going to pass from this earth, is going to die. But I'm okay with that, and I have grieved some of these losses throughout, so I'm going to feel less guilt about grieving and not having the same emotional reaction to the death at the end. I hope that makes sense to everyone. It's, grief can become very, very complicated, very, very complicated for everyone. It's not easy for anyone, even those of us who sort of work in death every day, grieve differently than what we watch many of the people that we work with grieve. So when the anticipatory grief is addressed, it can often help people to sort of come to terms more easily with the death at the end. But also when you accept what some of these losses are and what that looks like, it gives you the opportunity to connect differently with the person who is dying. And for one of the stories that I really like to tell, and I think there's a slide that addresses some more of this later on in the presentation, and if any of you have heard me give this presentation before, you've heard me tell part of this story. I didn't have the end of this story to tell, and I do now. I worked with a gentleman and worked with him for many, many years, whose wife, even when I first started to work with him, his wife was in the fairly late stages of dementia, and he was just not really grieving in a healthy way those losses that she had experienced. He was very angry, which we all know can be part of grief, and was very much in denial about what her disease process had been, what it was, what it looked like. And every time I saw this gentleman, whether it was in group, whether it was individually, he was crying and having such a hard time with the grief process. And I was struggling with sort of helping him work through what this looked like and how to get through this grief process throughout his journey. And what we know is if people do not work through their anticipatory grief and pre-death grief healthily, that they can often get stuck in complicated grief at the end. And complicated grief we'll talk a little bit more about in a future slide. Is when people become trapped and unable to move on after a death. And, you see, we all grieve differently. So, it may be that it takes some of us years to grieve. Others will seem to get over their grief rather quickly, but then there will be certain things that come up, a song or a particular recipe that we're cooking that sort of brings it all back, and we mourn again. Complicated grief is really where you become trapped and just unable to get through anything, unable to get through that grief, and sort of, just frozen and unable to react. Now, I was very concerned about this gentleman not working through his pre-death grief and becoming trapped in his grief later on. And he was making decisions. He was sort of not working through this grief, so he was making decisions that were maybe not the best decisions to be making, often just decisions that didn't seem to be well thought out. And so that goes back to some of those things, so the slide that we talked about where people who have complicated or difficult anticipatory grief may make bad decisions. And he was, what we all felt like we were working with him, not the best decisions on behalf of himself or his wife. But he and I became very, very close, and we were working through this grief, and he made the decision, even though his wife was in the very, very late stages of dementia at this point. She was nonverbal, didn't really know him anymore. It was very, very difficult for him, and he hit all of these risk factors. He had been very dependent on her throughout their entire marriage. He basically followed her for her career, did everything she wanted to do, was very dependent on her for his own happiness. His life revolved around her happiness in her life. And he had, again, fallen into one of those risk factors. He had moved away from their home where they had lived for many, many years to move her closer to her family, who did not offer the support that he felt like they would be offering when he moved her closer. So he had very few social supports. He had a life that had centered around her, and he was not able to find any kind of meaning in the death. It was a very cruel death for him, and he was unable to really sort of come to terms and cope with that. And so he was just having a difficult time grieving, and I was very concerned about him. And towards the end of her dementia, he opted to move her back to the place where they had come from. And we as professionals, and I say we, there was a team of people working with him, were very concerned that moving her would be incredibly detrimental to her health, that she would not understand the move. It would be more confusing for her. It would certainly speed up her death process. We were very concerned that this was not a good decision for her. However, I called him, and he had wanted, they were moving back to California. And one of the things that he said to me, and this is what completely changed my way of working with him, was, I get that this probably isn't good for her, but I want her in these last months of her life, I want her to walk on the beach and be able to put her toes in the sand just like we always did. I just want to create those pleasurable moments, those moments of joy for her one more time before she dies. And it was such an incredibly beautiful gesture on his part, and such a tremendous way of coping with this pre-death grief and this loss that he was experiencing. It was hard to argue with that, and it made me realize that, you know, even as a professional, I don't always know the right answer, and so, or my way is not always the right way. That he had a way of working through this grief within himself, and this way of creating this pleasurable experience for her in the end that was probably going to be very healthy for both of them. And so he did. Against most advice, he moved her back to California, to the beach. And I talked to him a couple of times after he moved there, and he was taking her out to the beach. You know, he had family there. They were helping him. They were taking her to the beach. I think that she was probably enjoying those moments. You know, we all know that with dementia, it really is moment to moment. She probably didn't remember that time on the beach, putting her toes in the sand after that. She certainly didn't know where she was going before that. She was in pretty late stage, very late stage, but she probably really enjoyed that in the moment. And what that did for him was to allow him to create those moments with her and to have that memory. And so she did pass. So for those of you who've heard the story before, the last time I told it, she was still living, and I was still a little bit worried about him, excuse me, and what that grief would look like. I have since heard from him. She died a few months ago, and I've talked to him a couple of times, and he went through a very healthy grief process. Not that it wasn't difficult for him. It was. He lost the person that his entire life had centered around. But in that simple act of taking her home, not so simple act, it was a complicated act to get her there, but taking her home, he was able to create moments with her that helped him work through his grief. And while I don't know that he ever found meaning in her illness, he did find meaning in taking her back home. And he was able to work through that grief in a process that was very healthy. And he didn't feel a lot of guilt in the end because he felt like he had done something to make her happy. I'm certainly not advocating that everyone take your loved one and move them back home or do something like that. But my point is, you know, sometimes you are the only person who knows how to work through that grief best for you. And he did so in a way that was very healthy for him. So anticipatory grief begins before a loss, and generally when one gets the news that death is likely or imminent, and we've already talked about pre-death grief happens throughout the disease process. And then complicated grief we talked about, people become trapped and unable to progress. And that doesn't mean that just because you work through your anticipatory and pre-death grief throughout that you won't experience grief at the end. And it may become complicated grief at the end. We all experience grief differently. If you feel like you have become trapped and paralyzed after the person dies, and you just can't seem to get up and face the day, please reach out for professional help. There is a lot that we can do to help you walk through that grief. So what are the symptoms of anticipatory or pre-death grief? Anxiety, sadness and tearfulness, fear, higher intensity irritability and anger, loneliness, a desire to talk, guilt. We've talked about guilt already. An intense concern for the dying person. Rehearsal of the death. What steps do I need to take? What's going to happen when my loved one dies? Physical problems. So, we know that grief is not just an emotional manifestation. You can experience headaches and gastrointestinal type problems, high blood pressure, heart issues. All of these things can be associated with grief. Fears of loss, compassion and concern for children. Loss of compassion, loss of concern for children. Anticipatory grief is time limited because that ends when the person dies. Post-bereavement is not, and we already talked about that a little bit. Some people may grieve for years and years and years, and that's absolutely okay. Everyone experiences that grief differently. So as you read through this list of symptoms, anxiety, sadness and tearfulness, irritability, anger, loneliness, what else are those symptoms of? Caregiver stress, right? We talk about these same types of symptoms related to caregiver stress. We're tired, depressed, sad, cry a lot, don't feel like talking to anyone, or feel like talking to everyone about what's happening with you, but then feel guilty because that's all you ever talk about. So all of these things, all of these symptoms are also symptoms of caregiver stress. So as you can see, as a caregiver, pre-death grief can get very complicated because it also often looks like caregiver stress. So what does that mean? Well, caregiver stress and grief can very much be related. When you're a caregiver, the emotions that you experience are incredibly difficult. They sort of get all wrapped up into each other. So just because you're experiencing some of these things doesn't necessarily mean you're experiencing grief, but I can almost guarantee you that you're experiencing some grief. If you are a caregiver of someone with dementia, you're experiencing caregiver stress, you're experiencing pre-death grief. So all of these things are linked to each other. How do you know the difference? We often talk about the stages of grief, and the 5 stages of grief have kind of gone out. It's kind of old school. We don't often talk about walking through those stages like we did before, but you still experience a lot of those things: the anger, the sadness, the bargaining, the denial. But why we don't talk about the stages of grief is because we recognize that they're not really stages. You don't walk through them in order. That you often experience many of these things simultaneously. You may go back and forth from one stage in quotes to the next. It may not be in the order that our book tells us that we are supposed to step through the stages of grief. So talking about the stages of grief has really gone out of fashion, but we do know that you experience all of those things that we used to talk about with the stages. Those are the same things that you experience with caregiver stress as well. Grief is often associated with some sort of loss that you have seen. So the loss of the ability to drive, like we talked about before, the loss of really being able to verbalize. And what I don't want you to do is to get too caught up on, am I experiencing just caregiver stress, or is this grief? Because it's likely that it's both. And so the interventions that we're going to talk about are good for caregiver stress and for grief. So if you're confused about, am I grieving? You probably are, but don't get too worked up about what is it that I'm really experiencing. When I am sitting in a support group and someone starts to share about what they're experiencing or what they're feeling, I will often stop at the end of that and say, I know that you're under a lot of stress, but it sounds to me like right now you're experiencing grief as well. And so then we can talk about that and work through that. So we've talked about the difficulty of anticipatory and pre-death grief, but it can also be very helpful and very beneficial. And I want to talk a little bit about that too. Opportunity to find meaning and closure. Families can reconcile differences, grant and give forgiveness, say goodbye. I have worked with several caregivers, and this is always such a beautiful thing to witness, where certain family members have been estranged for years and years. When you start to work through this grief process with your loved one with dementia early on, often it gives them the opportunity to reconnect with people that maybe they haven't connected with. And I have seen this happen on a number of occasions, where someone with dementia, with the help of their family or their loved one, has reached out to other family members or friends that they have not spoken to for whatever reason, for many, many years. And that is a great way to be able to connect some meaning to what is happening, to connect something positive with the grief process. So, doing these things doesn't make the grieving process easier, but it can make the death feel a little bit more natural. And we have talked about that before. And an example, a grandmother who was dying asked her granddaughter to sing with her. And as they began singing with tears in their eyes, they hugged each other one final time. So, understanding that grief process and anticipatory grief can often give you ways to connect with your loved one that you hadn't maybe thought about connecting with before. And that goes back to the story I was talking about, where, he needed for himself, for his wife, to move back home, to feel that sand between her toes one more time. It didn't make his grief easier. It didn't make his grief less, but it did lessen some of the guilt and those feelings of anguish that came with that. So what are some other things that you can do to assist with anticipatory or pre-death grief? Photographing relationships for remembering. One of the ways we want to work through that grief is to help give some meaning to the person's, not death, but life. What meaning has this person's life brought to me? Everyone has a legacy to leave. Everyone has brought meaning to someone's life. And I know that can often get very hard to see when you're in the middle of dementia. Very hard to remember those things that make the person that they are. But everyone has a legacy to leave, even if it's as simple as writing out favorite recipes. So create those photographs, create those relationships with people. Bedside singing, reminiscing. And people with dementia, often reminiscing is a very good therapeutic activity to use with them. They may not remember what happened a couple of weeks ago or a couple of days ago, but they can often remember fantastic stories about their childhood, even if they're not always exactly correct. One of the greatest pieces of advice I heard years ago, and I don't even remember where I heard it, but I like to repeat it because it made an impact on me. Someone was talking about, when you are a caregiver for someone with dementia, they will often tell you the same story over and over and over again till you never want to hear that story again, because you can tell it verbatim. Take that opportunity to listen even when you've heard it over and over and over and over again, because at some point that person will not be able to tell you that story anymore, but you can tell them their story. And that will be such a special way to connect with them, because you can tell them their own story back. Music, singing, playing an instrument, making a playlist of their favorite songs, religious rituals that were important to them. So when I say techniques to assist with this anticipatory grief, doing these things with the person who has dementia. So creating the connections with the person who has dementia, creating those memories, those moments of joy, creating a life legacy. And then recognizing and asking a question, so many caregivers, is it okay for me to be okay? If this person that I love is going through this horrible thing, and if you're a caregiver, you're going through it too. dementia is very much a family disease. You're going through it too. Is it okay for me to be okay? Is it okay for me to be okay after this person dies? And the answer is yes, it's okay for you to be okay. Ask yourself, and I always get comments when I say this, would the person that you love want you to not be okay after they're gone? And most of the time that answer is going to be no. I always get comments where someone will say, yes, they would want me to be miserable without them. But most people would not want you to not be okay if they were no longer here or when they're no longer here. It's okay for you to be okay. So, I think one of the keys to pre-death grief, we talk so much in dementia about loss. My husband cannot communicate with me in the same way he used to communicate with me. My wife cannot cook for the family anymore. And that was the thing that gave her the most joy, having all of the family home for the holidays and being able to cook. And we talk so much about those losses that happen when someone has dementia. The key to working through so much of this grief is not to forget about the life that someone with dementia still has left. Yes, there are so many losses that happen, but we cannot forget that even with dementia, there is life. It may not look the same. It may look very different. Maybe you can't play bridge like you used to play, but can you still play Go Fish? Maybe she can't cook a recipe for the family anymore, but can she still cut up a salad? There's so many things that you can still enjoy with a person with dementia. So do not forget to create those pleasurable memories, those pleasurable moments. And when you create them, some of this grieving process gets easier. It's not easy. I don't want to say it's easy, but it gets easier because you are making connections with the person in a way that maybe you would not have connected with them before. So being able to have those photographs to remembering the last time the whole family was together and you all sang grandma's favorite hymns, or you all sang dad's favorite country western songs. Telling the story to the family about the dog that chased your dad down the street, or whatever the story was. Don't forget to connect and enjoy the life that someone with dementia still has left. That will help you to work through some of that anticipatory grief. Group therapy. So one of the probably best ways of working through some of this pre-death grieving is through groups. Certainly individualized consultations and help can work, but there is nothing like being able to share what you're feeling with other people who are going through the same thing. At the Schmeating Center, we do a anticipatory grief group, and it's an 8-week group that is just focusing on this pre-death grief. And when I say just focusing on that, the point of the group is pre-death grieving. It's certainly the agenda of the group, the curriculum that we use, but that group often takes on, every time we've done it, it sort of takes on a life of its own based on the people who are in that group. And so sometimes just being able to talk about other things not necessarily related to loss is good for the group to help connect as well. So finding a grief group, finding a pre-death grief group or anticipatory grief group can be very, very helpful. But there aren't a lot of those around, and they're not for everybody. It's a lot of work to talk about grief and loss, and that may not be what you're quite ready for yet. So just finding a support group with a good facilitator. A support group facilitator who is comfortable in talking about grief and loss is so important, because you will sort of address that in each group. Support groups, we often think about they're sitting around telling each other our problems, hearing everyone else's problems. But support groups, for those of you who haven't joined one, could be a great way to just information share and learn about things that other people have experienced. But certainly in the groups that I do, and we do about 12 different groups here at the Schmeating Center, support groups for caregivers. Even now during COVID, we're doing about 7 or 8 of those via Zoom. Grief and loss comes up in almost every group. And we may name it during the group. So we may talk about, hey, what you're experiencing is grief. Let's talk about that a little bit. And we may not necessarily call it and name it that. It may just be that we do some activities that day to sort of work through that grief process, like stopping to say, okay, tell me your favorite story about your husband, or tell me what you're thankful for in your life with your mom. And so just sort of focusing on some of those coping mechanisms that we talked about earlier can be very, very helpful as well. If you can't join a group and can't get to a group, you can certainly do those things with friends, do those things with family, do those things with the person with dementia if you still can, just to help you sort of walk through and find that connection. And of course, for every caregiver, and I know we talk about this, if you have been to any type of caregiver workshop, if you've been to any type of caregiver conference, we always talk about these things because, again, these types of things will help with the caregiver stress, but it will also help with this pre-death grieving. So making sure that you maintain a healthy diet, exercise when you can, get a good night's sleep, spending time outdoors, just being outside in nature, meditation, massage, aromatherapy, any of those things that you do that gives a little bit of time to yourself, that makes you feel good about life, good about yourself. And I know it's very easy for me to say to do these things and very, very hard to put these things into practice when you're a caregiver. If you can do something like eat some healthy vegetables, even if it's not as often as you would like, if it, or just a few times a week, if you can get out and take a walk even for 10 minutes, or just shut yourself in the bathroom for 10 minutes and do some deep breathing, anything that you can do to sort of shut your brain down, calm your brain down, will be good for your stress level, but also help with some of this grief process that you're going through as well. You're not going to avoid grief. It happens. It happens with any kind of terminal illness, and it certainly happens with dementia. And I don't think that any of us as caregivers can even avoid the anticipatory or pre-death grief. No matter how healthy of a relationship we had, how healthy of a lifestyle we have, it's natural to grieve those losses. But as you're grieving them, again, if I can stress nothing else, take time to embrace some positive things that are happening in your life as well. Some positive memories you have of that person with dementia, because that will help you work through that grief. And finally, reach out for help. If you feel like I just seem to be going through this grief just over and over and over again, and I'm not really sure how to get out of it, please pick up the phone, call me at the Schmeating Center, call Alzheimer's Arkansas, call a friend, and let's just work through that grief, because we do want you to experience it in a healthy way. So I hope you all found this presentation helpful today. Again, do not forget to appreciate those special moments in life with your loved ones. And I hope to see all of you in person soon.